Hey there, everybody. Steve, the amateur historian. How y'all doing tonight? Now, usually when I delve into episodes in this series, usually, even if I say there's not a lot of information out there on this case, there's usually enough for you to put the general pieces together. Even though you may not know who was responsible in this case, you at least know, for a given victim, you know probably general motive of why they were killed, how they were killed, if they were killed. And this story that I'm about to bring to you it hinges the most, I think, in this series on maybe not being a murder, and that's just because in the minimal amount of details we know about it, we can't say for certain that murder was involved, but I have a sneaky suspicion there very well could have been murder, as well as possibly a cover-up of some kind, at least a partial cover-up, something to make this go away, because unfortunately when you have cases that aren't really going anywhere and there's not much to go on, authorities all too often try to find an easy way out, a way to kind of dismiss a case. And then you don't have to deal with the drama of not solving it if you can find some way to make it disappear or find some maybe plausible, albeit unlikely, resolution to that situation. This is just a strange and bizarre and very mysterious, even beyond other mysteries I've covered in this series. This is even more mysterious. I can't even say for absolute certainty what happened here, but it's definitely suspicious. This is the story of the Stenger couple, who both turned up dead in Portland in 1947. So it's January 1947, start of the year. A 26-year-old woman named Edythe Brock, who grew up, I think, primarily in the St. Helens area. At least it says for one of her other siblings, who was, I think, only a couple years younger than her, that they grew up in the St. Helens area. And by the age of 26, Edythe married a man by the name of Albert Stenger, who was 51 years old. The guy was nearly twice as old as her. Now, when you have marriages that have that large of an age gap between them, there's usually something a little bit strange about it. Sometimes people with a big enough age gap and they're both consenting adults, sometimes that just works out. But very often there's kind of unspoken drama, I can't really think of a better word than that right now, in marriages such as this. And especially if you have a man who's usually a bit older, there's usually some form of manipulation or some desire to never have to accept the fact that you're middle-aged, you're going into your later years. Let's get me a nice young wife to make me feel younger, or me being a predictable old man, let's find a younger woman that I can control, is often the case. So I try not to judge, but I'm a little bit weary, especially when I find a strange story and it just so happens it's between two people that were married, of which there was a considerable age gap involved. Now, the Stengers lived, and I only found this out because I randomly stumbled onto Edythe's obituary in what limited research I could come up with, and it said specifically that they lived at 4934 Union, which in the late 80s, Union became Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Portland. So I was able to find the exact spot where their home was. And apparently that home they lived in was an apartment building. As of this recording, I don't know what that building looked like. I might be able to find an image of it in some old pictures, but I wouldn't count on it. The site of that address today is an open lot. It's just south of the intersection of Martin Luther King Jr. and Alberta Street, so kind of heading pretty far north. It's technically in northeast Portland, even though you're only a couple blocks from being in the sector of Portland that's North Portland. That's where the Stengers lived. And what's really interesting is I went on to findagrave.com to try to find a little bit more information if possible. Sometimes you'll find articles people posted there that are articles I can't even find. And I was able to find, a little bit more information about the individuals involved. I was able to find a picture of Edythe sitting in her mom's lap when she was 2 years old. I think it was roughly 2 years old, because I think the picture was taken in 1922. So I was able to find a random image of this woman when she was just a baby. And I was able to find an image of what she looked like on her Find a Grave page. Never found a picture of Albert. Don't know what he looked like. Not that it really matters that much, but it's always nice when you can put a name to a face. But as I was looking up what I could find on findagrave.com, I went on to Albert Stenger's Find a Grave page. And it showed that it only listed him as having one wife. And it wasn't Edythe. There was marriage information on his page that showed in January 1947 that he married Edythe Brock. So it shows January 1947 they were married. However, under Albert's profile, there's only one wife listed. And it's a woman named Leota, Leota, Leota Palmer. And it says that they got married August 31st, 1946. So barely 3 months, barely a little more than 3 months before Albert married Edythe. So did they get married and discover really quickly that this wasn't going to work out and they got a divorce really quickly? That might have happened. I found no proof of that. I found no evidence beyond the fact that they were married and married again, end of August. So actually 4 months, sorry. Because you got to go through September, October, November, December. And then by January, he's marrying another woman. So I don't know if that was a quick divorce, if there was an annulment, if Albert Stenger made himself a bigamist by marrying Edythe. But I thought that was interesting, primarily because I couldn't find any proof that he ever divorced his first wife. And again, findagrave.com puts information that shows that he married Edythe Brock, but she's not listed as a wife of his on there. So I just found that to be very interesting. And what may be of further interest is Leota died April 27th, 1948. So, a year later, or about a year and a couple months after Albert and Edythe got married, Albert's first wife passed away. I couldn't find any real information about her other than that. And I only found that because she was listed as a wife of Albert on findagrave.com. I just found that she died April 27th, 1948, and she was 57 years old. So she was about 30 years older than Edythe. So she was actually older than Albert Stenger. So he marries a woman who's like 6 years older than him, and then a couple months later marries a woman who's half his age. It's very, very bizarre. But what's most interesting is, and with little fanfare, or, at least with very limited attention as far as I could gather, both Edythe and Albert passed away only a couple months after they were married. And there was no real attention in the newspapers. I didn't find their obituaries in the newspapers. The only reason I found Edythe's obituary was because it was on findagrave.com. It wasn't posted in any newspapers. In fact, when I searched them up, because I just stumbled onto the case by looking up general, like, unsolved Portland stuff on newspapers.com and trying to see what would pop up. That's how I discovered this case. But the only articles posted in relation to the Stengers and what happened to them were posted during a very brief period between June 12th and June 16th of 1947. So there was only like a 4-day period where I could find any articles posted about this couple, and many of those articles kind of repeated the same information over and over again. So there wasn't a whole lot to take away from many of these articles. But those didn't even pop up until after Edythe had been dead for over 2 months, and Albert had been dead for about 2 weeks at that point. So when they actually died, there was no mention, no discussion about them. They didn't get any kind of attention until mid-June of 1947. And even by the last article I read, this is what's part of what's so incredibly interesting and mysterious about this, is there was never any explanation as to what Edythe Stenger died of. Whether it was some disease, some accident, she was murdered, committed suicide, there was nothing. Even by the last article I could find on this case, they still expressed that the cause of her death was unknown. And this would have been by June 16th. Now, Edythe Brock died on April 3rd, 1947. So she died 2.5 months earlier. They still had it wasn't even like they were theorizing, and I can only assume she had an autopsy. They had no idea what she died of. That was the constant information given. And even in her obituary, they didn't say, like, tragically Edythe passed away. You wouldn't even need super details, but there would at least be something. She passed away from an illness. She passed away due to an accident. But there was nothing. No information. So I have no clue why this woman, who was only 26 years old, died possibly less than 4 months after getting married to Albert Stenger. And it's interesting because in her obituary it says, married to her beloved husband Albert. And yet I kind of wondered through all this. I'm already starting to think, like, was Albert really all that beloved of a man in her life? What caused her death? We don't know. And in terms of Albert, he passes away May 27th, 1947. So roughly just a little over, about 7 weeks after his wife passes away. And the only description that they gave in terms of how he died was that he took a kind of rare drug. And he took enough of it that it could poison him to death, and he passed away due to that. Now, Albert Stenger was described as a druggist, which means he worked in a pharmacy. So you think, okay, he works in a pharmacy surrounded by all these drugs and medication. He got depressed because his wife had died recently. He's despondent. He's middle-aged. Maybe he thinks there's really not a whole lot left for him in life, and he's got all these drugs accessible to him. So he grabs a drug that he knows if he takes enough of it, it'll kill him dead, and it's an easy way to shuffle off of this mortal coil. But newspapers locally said that the type of drug he took, and they never gave a name for the type of drug he took, but they said specifically that the type of drug he used to kill himself was a drug that at that time was not available in pharmacies. Now, as a pharmacist, he may have had connections. He may have known someone that he could get off-the-shelf drugs from. And, he tells that person, oh, hey, I need this to help this person out, as, it's kind of an under-the-table kind of thing. Or, I need it for this, I need it for that. And he could have accessed this drug that way. But it is still interesting that the drug that killed him was one that generally he would not have had easy access to, even as a pharmacist. Now, why did it take so long for the deaths of these two to get attention? These two deaths that are, Edythe's is completely shrouded in mystery, and Albert's is definitely got some mysterious aspects to it. You can't really say definitively how either one of them died. Perhaps, it's easy to think that Albert died of suicide. He took the drugs himself. Granted, many murders in the past have been done by either poisoning someone, administering a drug into some drink or food or whatever, and then someone takes it unknowingly, or forcibly having someone take pills. Now, back in this time, a lot of drugs were in liquid form, so it would have been real easy to poison him. Why someone would want to poison Albert Stenger? I mean, I know practically nothing about the guy except he apparently liked to marry a younger woman and he was a pharmacist. So I don't know what issues other people may have had with him. Maybe Edyth's, somebody in Edyth's family or someone close to them didn't like the fact that this older guy had kind of, dragged her into his life and convinced her that he was good for her when he probably was just an older guy looking for a younger woman. And maybe, it could have been somebody who loved Edyth, held him accountable for why she died, and took revenge finally. Finally, they sat there and the weeks passed, and finally they just couldn't hold back. And it was like, this is it. I know he had something to do with this. He's a bastard. I'm going to poison him. Take him out. Get your hands on some obscure poison that probably can't be traced to you. Take a guy out. Something like that could have happened. We have no idea. But why this case finally got attention in the papers was there was a letter discovered, penned by Edyth, and it clearly appears as though this letter was hidden. She didn't want this to be found, at least without some heavy searching, because she had apparently hidden it between the lining of a box, like the box and then the lining that goes around it. She had snuck the letter in between the two. So this was a hidden item. You had to be searching around in order to find this. Now, how this letter was discovered is another thing left in mystery, because you think she's been dead for a couple of months, her husband's been dead for a couple of weeks. You think if there was any kind of police investigation into this, just to make sure at least there was nothing, no foul play here or whatever, that investigation would have happened a little while back. But it seems like somebody just kind of stumbled onto this. But this doesn't seem like something easy to stumble onto. This seems like something you would have to actually be digging around and searching. Maybe she had family members that were clearing out their apartment, and they were kind of just going through stuff. Someone noticed a kind of indentation or a slight thickening to the lining of this box and was like, what's that? Or maybe you could make out the outline of the letter in the box, whatever. Somebody stumbled onto this letter, even though it was extremely well hidden. And this letter had been written by Edyth, and it was written to it was addressed to a close friend of hers, obviously never delivered. And it was addressed, it was dated in November. It was November 12th, presumably 1946. It's presumed she did it the November previous to when she died. So several months before she passed. And in it, she expressed having fears for her life, fears for her safety, that immediately people attributed to her treatment by Albert. So theoretically, you have this piece of evidence suddenly pop up that suggests this woman was living in fear of her husband, and then she turns up dead a couple months later. It's very suspicious. And if her husband was responsible, it makes it look even more like, maybe he just couldn't deal with what he had done. And then he takes his life a few weeks later. But what's interesting is this is almost 2 months before they got married. Obviously, they could have been together for a little while before they got married, but this is not even 2.5 months after Albert is supposedly married another woman. So I can't say exactly what the dynamic was between Edyth and Albert as of November. All I know is they got married in January. So that's an interesting twist to things. Was she with him at that time? And if she was, already so fearful for her safety, presumably around this guy, and they hadn't even been together that long, why would she willingly marry him roughly 2 months later? Was her letter in reference to somebody else? Was there some other guy that had been in her life? And we're just conveniently making Albert look guilty when really he's just a scapegoat in the situation. That's something else we don't know. One of the reasons we don't really know anything further is because that was the only information provided by police, really, was that this letter was written by Edythe to a friend in November, and it expressed that she was living in fear for her life for some reason. But authorities refused to elaborate any further in any way, shape, or form on that matter. But it started to shift the direction as to why she died, which leads me to think that she died suspiciously. Again, we don't know. But it really started to make them focus in on Albert Stenger as likely being responsible for her murder, because we have a letter here that says she lived in fear of him. That sentiment lasted for maybe a day. And it's reported that yet another letter has been found. The circumstances of how this letter was found wasn't stated, but it was another letter penned by Edythe. And this letter was dated April 2nd, 1947, the day before her death. Now, in terms of this letter, once again, authorities were very mum about what had been expressed in it. But in this vein, they gave no details about what was written, whether this was another letter that expressed further her fear for her safety, which would be very damning considering she would be dead within 24 hours. All that was reported in terms of this second letter was that the police were already beginning to reassess the reassessment they had made when they found the first letter, making them think maybe Albert was responsible and putting his wife in a situation where she was fearing for her life. After the discovery of the second letter, now suddenly they're saying, well, we're back at square one, meaning we pretty much doubt that Albert had any real involvement in his wife's death, again, whatever that entailed. And all they expressed, which you can infer why they shifted directions again, is that the wording, I guess, of this second letter indicated to them that this was being written by someone who was likely suffering from a mental illness of some kind. So this second letter was telling authorities, hey, Edythe Stenger probably had a mental illness of some kind. She had some kind of issues, so therefore it was probably pretty easy for them to dismiss the first letter as probably the ramblings of someone who was paranoid or someone who was fearing things that weren't really there. And, you know, it's the 1940s. It was real easy. The moment any kind of governing body, anytime someone's on trial, the police are trying to investigate something, the moment you deem someone likely has a mental illness, all credibility is completely gone, and you can completely just undo everything that preceded that. So whether Edythe was actually legitimately fearing for her life, which if she had a mental illness, that doesn't mean she didn't have fears based in truth. Mental illness, like so many things, it can go in any number of directions, and it doesn't automatically mean that you are just unreliable in terms of everything. That's a very slanted and ignorant way to look at mental illness, by just shoving, when it comes to certain concepts, just shoving them all, everybody who's got a mental illness, into one box, saying, oh, they said this happened, well, they're mentally ill, so they're probably lying. But again, it was the 1940s, and I mean, even psychologists didn't know a whole lot about mental illness yet. So what would you expect the police to know about mental illness? So the discovery of this second letter, which is, even compared to the first letter, is so shrouded in mystery, they were able to use that letter to pretty much dismiss all of the new intrigue in the case and the suggestion that the now dead Albert may have played a part in his wife's death. But, there was details given on the first letter, how it was found, how it was hidden, who it was addressed to. At least a little bit of information that was conveyed in the letter. But in this case, it's just a second letter was found. It was written by Edythe, dated conveniently the day before she died. And that was generally all the information that they gave out. And of course, the article that I read about this in, they made sure to mention yet again, we don't know what caused Edythe Stenger's death, which is just so bizarre to me at this point. 2.5 months down the road from when she's died, and there's no idea that how she died. And yeah, June 16th, 1947, that was the very the latest dated article that I could find on this case. I only found articles from between June 12th and June 16th of 1947. And obviously nothing else on the internet. I mean, aside from what I found on findagrave.com, and I'm stunned I found as much as I did there. But it seems like after that second letter was discovered, and I'm using air quotes for a reason, because I think there was some fishy crap going on here. After the discovery of that second note, and that was reported in newspapers, the case just faded away. It was just completely off the table. And it was like it wasn't brought up again after that. Like authorities said, we thought we had something. There's nothing here. I just find it so interesting that the second letter pops up and it conveniently dismisses all of this other stuff because, hey, if you acknowledge that this letter means something, now you got to dig into this more. You got to investigate a guy who's already dead. And a lot of times, even if you hadn't proven that somebody was guilty of something, a lot of times if they died, it was like, all right, he's dead. We can't interrogate him. We can't talk to him. Let's just all assume that he was responsible. That was very real stuff that happened back in the day, and it still kind of happens off and on today. But one of the biggest red flags in this story is that the primary investigating officer in this matter, he's the only officer who is quoted in these articles. He was the one who said, we found this first letter, gave general information, but said we're not going into any further information. He's also the one that comes out and says, hey, we found this second letter, and we're not going into any details on that either. And that officer that was the head guy in all this was a guy named Jim Purcell. Diamond Jim Purcell, as he was known. And he ended up becoming pretty significant in Portland police, and then in the 1950s kind of got booted out in disgrace because he was about as crooked as they come. When I interviewed the late J.D. Chandler for my documentary on the 1946 torso murder case, a documentary I did called The Woman in the Water. It's on my YouTube channel. You can go find it if you want to and see what I'm talking about here. I didn't really know who Jim Purcell was when I went to JD's place to interview him. And I noticed that he mentioned Jim Purcell, and he kind of came back to him a few times. And even when I end the documentary, I end with an essence of him discussing, part of the reason why that torso victim case hadn't been solved could have been that the police were involved in her death. And the woman that I think was the victim, and who J.D. Chandler and some others think was the victim, was a woman named Anna Schrader, who worked with the Portland police during the 20s and had a lot of secrets about them and happened to be carrying on an affair with a very prominent officer on their force. And then that scandal broke, and Anna Schrader was a potential threat to the Portland police, so it would make sense that they would have had her killed if she kept raising any troubles. And J.D. Chandler said, someone like Jim Purcell would have been perfect to take on the responsibility of saying, like, okay, here's this murder case, but we're not going to look into it that hard. We're going to shut this case down so that, there's not going to be extensive investigation into it. Even when the victim's head was found that had a very distinct teeth that probably could have been compared with to dental records. There's no evidence that there was even an effort to make that happen. And after a while, all of the evidence disappeared. The clothing that was on the torso victim disappeared. The sacks that her remains were. All this evidence just disappeared. And J.D. Chandler very much felt that Jim Purcell could have been deeply involved in the quashing of that case. And even if he wasn't, even if somehow he had nothing to do with that case, he had an extensive record of corruption. And, you know, if there was something going on that the police didn't want to deal with, or that the police wanted crushed and, you know, distract the public, nothing to see here, Diamond Jim was just the kind of guy to take on that responsibility. So if you have a case like this and Jim Purcell is involved, it's a little suspicious to me that these two people die and there's not really a lot of attention paid to the case, and then suddenly a letter's found and it hits the papers, and all of a sudden people are wondering, hey, maybe there's something here that we didn't notice before. And then, you know, short while later, Jim Purcell gets on the horn and says, hey, we found a second letter. Shows that this chick is nuts. You can't rely on anything she said. The first letter's, you know, it's probably just the ramblings of a crazy woman. And I don't know if there's any evidence beyond this presumption about this second letter that Edythe Stenger had any mental illness issues at all. I know nothing about the woman, but it seems rather convenient that they suddenly found this second letter and it helped them pretty much shut the door on the theories that had been building up since the discovery of that first letter. And Diamond Jim Purcell is not just involved, but he's the head guy here. I'm not trying to start any wild conspiracy theories, but I mean, this is a case where so little is known. We don't even know if a murder happened here, but it very potentially may have been a case of a husband murdering his wife for whatever reason. And again, the threatening letter that Edythe wrote in November, if that was a truthful letter, maybe that was in reference to another guy she'd been mixed up, and maybe that guy was jealous and possessive of her and couldn't handle it when she went off and married another guy, and finally the rage boiled over and he killed her. But it seems like if something like that happened, if she was murdered by a jealous ex-lover, by her husband, those are usually crimes with an element of passion to them. They're usually pretty clear that a murder took place. So again, the fact that 2.5 months down the line, we still don't know what Edythe Stenger died of, that's suspicious to me, and that may just be another element of something that was being covered up. Maybe Jim Purcell was involved in that too. So that you come up with a second letter, dismisses everything that's been reported in papers recently. It theoretically dismisses the credibility of the woman who died that penned these letters, and it seemingly successfully so managed to knock this case out of the newspapers, because after that acknowledgement of that second letter, all of a sudden I could find no more articles about this situation, even though there was still so many unanswered questions. And even if you could dismiss this first letter with this second letter, which I don't think you can in and of itself, but let's just say for the sake of argument you could, we still have a woman who apparently died mysteriously, and we have a husband who, even though we know how he died, we don't even know if he alone was responsible for that or whether somebody else did it. I noticed that even though articles reference that he died by ingesting this certain type of drug that poisoned him to death, none of these articles explicitly said he committed suicide. They just said he died of taking this kind of rare and kind of hard to come by drug. So you still have great mystery here that's been brought to the public's attention in these other articles, independently of these letters that were found. So I find it very strange that just because one letter supposedly dismisses another, the attitude is, well, we don't need to talk about these people anymore. Just shh. We don't need to talk about the Stengers. Just let it go. They're both dead. They're both buried. Let's just move on. Let's not continue beating this horse in the mouth, so to speak. I know I botched that saying, and that could have easily happened too. It's very common, especially in cases that authorities don't want to be looked into that closely. There's the classic, like, hey, you know what? They're dead. A lot of time has passed. Let's just put the matter to rest. Which is a real easy way to say there's probably some creepy shit going on here that we don't want you to know about, so we'll just keep telling you there's nothing here until hopefully you believe us and then just kind of forget about it. And that seems to be what happened It seems after the midway point of June 1947, everybody forgot about the strange deaths of the Stengers, who had only been married for a couple of months. And there was these other oddities, like this mysterious earlier wife that Albert was married to, who then died, like literally 11 months to the day later after Albert died. There's so many strange mysteries to this, and the authorities just quashed it the first chance they had. So I'm very, very suspicious of the motives of the investigators, of Mr. Purcell, who again was a guy who a few years later on down the road left the police in, utter shame and embarrassment when his crooked record was finally revealed. I'm very suspicious about what happened here and whether Edythe Stenger may have been murdered, whether by her husband or by somebody else. And I'm also somewhat wonder whether her husband was murdered. Again, this is what I said when we started. I'm like, this is very interesting, but I don't even know for certain if a murder happened to either of these people. But considering the elements of the case, I'm very suspicious that one did. And that's why I chose to include it in this series. And it was just for what little information there was out there, and how briefly it was just a little blip in the news, how just crazy and just messed up this whole thing is. And odds are, with how quickly it came up and was forgotten, I highly doubt there will ever be a resolution to this, like some other cases. But it was just, the police quashed it and everyone forgot about it. And that was over 70 years ago. And it hasn't been brought up since. I don't think it's on the list of, current day Portland police priorities. Even cold case units, I don't really think a case like this is at the top of their list in terms of things to solve, when they can't even say for certain a murder took place here. The most consistent piece of information that can be taken away from this thing is that they both died in their apartment. They both died in the same room. That's like the only thing that you can definitively say even correlates these two deaths. So it's hard to think, and it's hard to believe, and it's hard to even hope that a legitimate resolution is ever going to be found in this case. But what a strange story. And just so many questions left unanswered and so many red flags. I just had to cover it. And all that said, for how little there is to be known about this case, I hope you still enjoyed it, and I hope I was able to convey it to you the best I could, considering, usually when I do videos on this series, I have 4 or 5 pages of notes, and this one barely hit about 2 pages. And that's with extra stuff, extra information about, where they lived, and trying to get down a little extra information about Albert's first wife, or previous wife. So again, I hope you were able to enjoy it. And if you're new to the channel or just haven't done it yet, I'd like to remind you, you give the video a like, helps the video. Subscribing to the channel also helps my channel grow. And I also have a Patreon page if you want to help me out that way. It makes it a lot easier for me to continue doing what I do here. So if you want to join up and become a Patreon supporter today, that's deeply appreciated. Thank you in advance. The link to that is in the description with this video, as well as the links to some other pages I have, my Facebook page, my Instagram, and my Reddit subreddit, which admittedly I need to use a little more often. There really isn't much up there yet, but I'm planning on putting more on there over time. And all of that said, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian. Thanks for watching.